Picture this. It's a cold October morning in 1863. The mist rises from a battlefield where thousands of young men lie sleeping, but not the peaceful sleep you're about to enjoy. These soldiers haven't seen a comfortable bed in months. Their last meal was hardtack biscuits so tough they nicknamed them tooth dullers. And their uniforms hang in tatters, offering little protection from the biting wind that cuts across the Pennsylvania countryside. Welcome to Doze Through History, where we explore the past in the most relaxing way possible. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into one of the most challenging periods to be a common soldier in American history. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our historical journeys into peaceful slumber. And if you're enjoying this content, a gentle tap on the like button helps more people discover these restful historical tales. Close your eyes now, settle into your comfortable bed, and let me transport you back to a time when such comfort was nothing but a distant memory for hundreds of thousands of young Americans. Tonight, we'll walk through the daily struggles, the small hopes, and the quiet moments of humanity that define the experience of Civil War soldiers on both sides of the conflict. The year is 1861, and across America, drums are beating, flags are waving, and young men are marching off to what they believe will be a grand adventure. In small towns from Maine to Georgia, from Ohio to Texas, recruitment rallies fill courthouse squares with the sounds of brass bands and stirring speeches. Imagine yourself as 18-year-old Thomas Mitchell from a small farming community in Illinois. The corn is tall in the fields. The summer air is thick with humidity, and you're standing with your friends outside the general store, listening to a man in a crisp blue uniform paint pictures of glory and honor. He speaks of defending the Union, of being home by Christmas, of stories you'll tell your grandchildren about the time you helped save the nation. Your mother packed your belongings in a small canvas bag, 2 spare shirts, an extra pair of socks she knitted herself, a small Bible, and a daguerreotype of your family. As the train whistle echoes across the prairie, carrying you away from everything you've ever known, you have no idea that the socks your mother made will be worth more than gold in the months to come, and that the Bible will become your pillow on countless nights when sleep seems impossible. The reality begins to set in during those first days at the recruitment camp. The glamorous uniforms exist only for the officers and the recruitment posters. You're handed a ruffle coat that scratches your skin, pants that don't quite fit, and boots that were clearly made for someone with different feet entirely. The brass buttons are already tarnishing, and there are mysterious stains on the fabric that you try not to think about too deeply. But it's not just the uniforms that shatter illusions. The food is unlike anything you've experienced. At home, even during the leanest times, your mother could make a satisfying meal from whatever the farm provided. Here, you're introduced to hardtack, a simple biscuit made of flour and water, baked until it's harder than the wooden planks of the barracks floor. Veterans joke that you can build a house with hardtack and use it as ammunition when you run out of bullets. The joke isn't entirely untrue. If you're finding peace in this historical journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History. We have many more restful adventures through time waiting for you. The romantic notion of soldiers marching in perfect formation, flags streaming in the breeze, bands playing patriotic songs, exists mainly in paintings and poems. The reality of a Civil War march is far more mundane and infinitely more exhausting. Picture yourself now as part of a long, snaking column of men stretching as far as the eye can see in both directions. It's early spring in Virginia, and the roads are nothing more than muddy tracks carved by thousands of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels. The rain that began as a light drizzle at dawn has steadily intensified, turning the packed earth into a thick, sucking mud that grabs at your ill-fitting boots with every step. Your pack, which seemed manageable when you first shouldered it at camp, now feels like it's filled with stones. The weight of your musket, initially a symbol of your readiness to serve, has become a 40-inch burden that seems to grow heavier with each mile. Your shoulders ache, your feet are already developing blisters that will plague you for weeks, and you've only been marching for 3 hours. Around you, the sounds create a strange symphony of suffering and endurance. There's the constant squelch of feet pulling free from mud, the creak of leather straps and wooden wagon wheels, the occasional curse muttered under someone's breath, and the persistent coughing that follows the army like a shadow. Some men sing quietly to pass the time, old hymns mostly, or folk songs from home. Others march in determined silence, lost in thoughts of family, sweethearts, or simply the dream of stopping to rest. The discipline of those early recruitment camp days begins to break down after the first 10 miles. Men start to shed items from their packs, extra clothing, books, personal mementos that seemed essential when they left home. The roadsides become littered with the abandoned possessions of soldiers who've learned the hard lesson that every ounce matters when you're carrying it for 15 or 20 miles a day. Water becomes an obsession. Your canteen, filled that morning from a creek that seemed perfectly clean, is empty by midday. The next water source might be miles away, and when you finally reach it, you'll share it with hundreds of other men and possibly their horses. You learn not to look too closely at the water you're drinking, not to think about what might have upstream, and to be grateful for any liquid that isn't actively making you sick. Food during a march is whatever you can carry and whatever you can scavenge. The army supply wagons, when they manage to keep up with the columns, provide the basics: hardtack, salt pork, and coffee when you're lucky. But more often, you're living on whatever you stuffed in your haversack at the last camp, supplemented by anything edible you can find along the way. Apples from abandoned orchards, vegetables from deserted gardens, sometimes even wild berries or nuts when the season is right. The nights during a march bring their own challenges. If you're fortunate, you might reach a predetermined camping spot with enough daylight left to properly set up camp. More often, darkness falls while the column is still moving, and you simply stop wherever you are when the order comes down the line. You might be sleeping in a field, a forest, or even on the road itself. Your bed is whatever you can arrange, your coat if you're lucky enough to have one that's not soaked through, a patch of ground that's slightly less rocky than the surrounding area, maybe a pile of leaves if you're in a wooded area. Your blanket, if it stayed dry, becomes your most precious possession. If it's wet, you face the choice between sleeping under a damp, cold covering or shivering through the night without any protection at all. Sleep comes fitfully if it comes at all. Your body aches from the day's march, your feet throb in boots that may have rubbed them raw, and the sounds of several thousand men trying to rest in the open air create a constant background of snoring, coughing, shifting, and the occasional cry from someone caught in a nightmare. Sentries pace the perimeter of the camp, their footsteps and low conversations a reminder that even in exhaustion, you're not truly safe. When the army stops moving and establishes a camp, whether for days, weeks, or occasionally months, a different kind of hardship begins. The excitement of movement and the anticipation of action give way to the grinding monotony of military routine and the constant struggle against boredom, disease, and despair. Imagine waking up in a military camp somewhere in Maryland in the autumn of 1862. The first sound you hear is the drum roll of reveille, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. You've been sleeping on the ground for so long that you barely remember what a real bed feels like, and your body has learned to find rest in positions that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Your tent, shared with 3 or 4 other men, is a marvel of efficient discomfort. The canvas is supposed to keep out rain, but it's developed a dozen small leaks that have been patched and repatched with whatever materials were available. The space inside is barely large enough for all of you to lie down, which means that when one person turns over, everyone else has to adjust. Privacy is a concept that belongs to your former life. The morning routine begins before sunrise. Roll call, where every man must be present and accounted for, regardless of how sick or exhausted he might be. Then comes the cleaning of equipment. Your musket must be spotless, your bayonet free of rust, your cartridge box organized and ready. The officers inspect everything with an attention to detail that would be admirable if it weren't so exhausting. Breakfast, when it's available, is a continuation of the hardtack and salt pork theme, occasionally supplemented with coffee that's been boiled so long it could strip paint. If you're clever and have managed to acquire some personal supplies, you might have a bit of sugar or honey to make the coffee more palatable. Some men have learned to crush their hardtack and fry it with bacon grease, creating a dish that's marginally more edible than the biscuits in their original form. The days in camp are filled with drill, and more drill, loading and firing your musket until you can do it blindfolded, marching in formation until every man can maintain perfect alignment without thinking, bayonet practice against imaginary enemies. The theory is that this repetitive training will serve you well in battle, and it's probably true, but the reality is hours of mind-numbing repetition under the watchful eyes of sergeants who seem to take personal pleasure in finding fault with your performance. Between drills, there are the endless chores that keep an army functioning. Digging latrines, hauling water, gathering firewood, cleaning equipment, mending clothing, washing whatever can be washed, and trying to maintain some semblance of sanitation in conditions that would challenge the hardiest pioneer. Letter writing becomes a precious ritual. When paper and ink are available, and when there's enough light to see by, soldiers pour their hearts out to family and friends back home. These letters, often the only connection to their former lives, are carefully crafted to maintain morale on both ends. The writers rarely describe the full extent of their hardships, instead focusing on their health, usually reported as good regardless of the truth. Their spirits, always high, according to the letters, and their hopes for a quick end to the conflict. The evenings, if there are no duties or drills scheduled, offer the closest thing to relaxation that camp life provides. Men gather around small fires to share stories, sing songs, play cards when they can find or make a deck, or simply sit in comfortable silence. These moments of human connection become incredibly precious, creating bonds between men that will last long after the war ends. Some soldiers develop elaborate hobbies to pass the time. Carving becomes popular. Men create everything from simple whistles to intricate figurines using nothing more than a pocket knife and whatever wood they can find. Others become skilled at games of chance, though gambling is officially discouraged and sometimes leads to serious conflicts between men who are already on edge from the stresses of military life. Take a moment now to let yourself settle deeper into relaxation. If this journey through history is helping you unwind, please consider subscribing to Doze Through History and hitting that like button. Your support helps us continue these peaceful explorations of the past. The relationship between a Civil War soldier and his food is complicated, frustrating, and occasionally desperate. What you eat or don't eat becomes one of the defining aspects of military life, occupying your thoughts during marches, your conversations around campfires, and your dreams during the long nights. The official rations, when they're available, tell the story of an army trying to feed hundreds of thousands of men with limited resources and primitive logistics. The standard issue includes hardtack, those infamous indestructible biscuits, salt pork or beef, beans, rice, coffee, sugar, and salt. On paper, this might seem adequate. In reality, the quality and availability of these items varies wildly depending on your location, the competence of your supply officers, and the proximity of enemy forces who might disrupt supply lines. Hardtack deserves special attention because it becomes such a central part of soldier life. These simple crackers, made from flour and water and baked until they're harder than wood, are designed to last indefinitely without spoiling. They achieve this goal admirably, but at the cost of being nearly inedible in their natural state. Soldiers develop elaborate methods for making hardtack palatable. Soaking it in coffee until it softens, frying it with bacon grease, crushing it and mixing it with whatever else is available, or simply gnawing on it like a dog with a bone. The hardtack often comes with additional protein in the form of weevils, small insects that somehow manage to infest even these rock-hard biscuits. Experienced soldiers learn to tap their hardtack against a hard surface before eating, listening for the sound of weevils moving inside. Some men give up this practice entirely, deciding that the extra protein is worth the psychological discomfort. Salt pork, the other staple of army rations, presents its own challenges. The meat is preserved in so much salt that it's nearly inedible without extensive preparation. It must be soaked to remove some of the salt, then boiled or fried, often resulting in a product that's only marginally more appetizing than leather. The pork is frequently rancid by the time it reaches the soldiers, adding the adventure of potential food poisoning to an already challenging meal. Coffee becomes more than just a beverage. It's a lifeline to normalcy, a source of warmth, and occasionally the only hot thing a soldier consumes in a day. When real coffee is available, it's treated with reverence. Men hoard their coffee rations, trade other items for coffee, and develop elaborate brewing techniques using whatever equipment they can improvise. When real coffee runs out, substitutes appear. Chicory, roasted corn, acorns, or whatever else might produce a dark, bitter liquid that can be consumed hot. Foraging becomes an essential skill. Soldiers learn to identify edible wild plants, to spot fruit trees and vegetable gardens, and to hunt or trap small game when the opportunity arises. Apple orchards become treasure troves. Cornfields are raided despite strict orders against it. And chicken coops mysteriously lose their occupants whenever an army passes through an area. The ethics of foraging create complex situations. Orders typically forbid taking food from civilian populations, but hungry soldiers faced with the choice between following orders and eating often choose to eat. This leads to a complex system of unofficial procurement where soldiers venture away from camp to find food that somehow appears at mealtime without anyone asking too many questions about its origin. Cooking methods are improvised and primitive. Most soldiers carry a simple tin cup and perhaps a knife, but elaborate cooking equipment is a luxury that few can afford to carry. Meals are prepared over open fires using whatever pots, pans, or makeshift containers can be found or fashioned from available materials. A half-dozen men might share a single frying pan, taking turns to prepare their individual rations. The social aspects of eating become incredibly important. Men form cooking groups, sharing equipment, ingredients, and labor. Someone who's skilled at making edible meals from army rations becomes a valuable member of any unit. Trading becomes an elaborate system. A man who doesn't drink might trade his coffee for someone else's sugar, or someone who's managed to acquire extra salt pork might trade it for hardtack or ammunition. Water, though not technically food, presents its own set of challenges. Clean drinking water is often scarce, and soldiers learn to drink from sources that would horrify modern sensibilities. Creek water shared with horses, standing water from questionable ponds, and sometimes water that's been sitting in barrels for weeks become acceptable when the alternative is dehydration. The psychological impact of poor food extends far beyond simple hunger. The constant struggle to find edible meals affects morale, health, and the ability to function effectively as a fighting force. Malnutrition weakens soldiers' immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease. Poor food contributes to digestive problems that can incapacitate men for days or weeks, and the mental energy spent thinking about, searching for, and preparing food is energy that can't be devoted to other necessary tasks. While battles and enemy bullets capture the dramatic attention of Civil War histories, the reality is that disease killed far more soldiers than combat ever did. For every man who died from a gunshot wound, 2 or 3 died from illness, infection, or the complications of diseases that would be easily treatable today. The conditions that fostered disease were everywhere in Civil War armies. Thousands of men, many from rural areas with limited exposure to infectious diseases, were suddenly crowded together in camps with primitive sanitation. Latrines were often inadequately constructed and positioned too close to water sources. Personal hygiene was limited by the availability of soap, clean water, and privacy. Medical knowledge of the time didn't include an understanding of germs or the importance of sterilization. Diarrhea and dysentery were so common that they were simply accepted as part of military life. These conditions, caused by contaminated food and water, poor sanitation, and inadequate cooking, could range from mild inconvenience to fatal illness. Soldiers developed their own crude terminology for the various intestinal ailments that plagued them, and the sounds and smells of men suffering from digestive troubles became part of the background of camp life. Typhoid fever swept through camps like wildfire, spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation. The disease began with fever, headache, and weakness, progressing to severe complications that could kill a strong young man in a matter of weeks. There was no effective treatment, and soldiers who contracted typhoid could only hope that their constitution was strong enough to survive the disease's progression. Malaria was endemic in many of the regions where armies campaigned, particularly in the swampy areas of the South. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria wasn't understood, so there was no effective prevention beyond the general advice to avoid bad air from swamps and stagnant water. Soldiers suffered from recurring fevers, chills, and weakness that could incapacitate them for months. Respiratory diseases flourished in the crowded, poorly ventilated conditions of military life. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various other lung ailments spread rapidly through units. The combination of poor nutrition, exposure to weather, and crowded living conditions created perfect circumstances for respiratory infections to develop and spread. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, appeared when soldiers went too long without fresh fruits or vegetables. The disease began with fatigue and joint pain, progressing to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and skin problems. While not immediately fatal, scurvy weakened soldiers and made them susceptible to other diseases and injuries. The treatment of disease was limited by the medical knowledge and resources of the time. Many remedies were based on tradition rather than scientific understanding. Doctors prescribed purgatives, bloodletting, and various herbal concoctions that often did more harm than good. Pain relief was limited to alcohol, opium, or simply enduring the discomfort. Field hospitals were scenes of organized chaos where overwhelmed medical personnel did what they could with limited supplies and primitive equipment. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or with only basic pain relief. Antiseptic procedures were unknown, so infection following surgery was common and often fatal. The psychological impact of watching friends and comrades die from disease was profound. These weren't glorious deaths in battle, but slow, painful deteriorations that often lasted weeks or months. Soldiers watched strong, healthy men waste away from diseases they couldn't understand or effectively treat, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety about their own health. Some soldiers developed elaborate personal hygiene routines and superstitions designed to ward off disease. They might insist on boiling their water, refuse to eat certain foods, or follow complex rituals for cleaning their equipment and clothing. Whether these practices were medically sound or not, they provided some psychological comfort in an environment where disease seemed to strike randomly. The constant presence of disease affected military strategy and logistics. Commanders had to account for the fact that a significant percentage of their force would be incapacitated by illness at any given time. Hospitals and medical supplies became as important as ammunition and food, and the evacuation of sick soldiers required dedicated resources and transportation. Let yourself breathe deeply now, grateful for the medical knowledge and sanitation that we often take for granted today. The weather didn't choose sides in the Civil War, but it certainly felt like an enemy to soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Unlike modern armies with sophisticated gear and climate-controlled environments, Civil War soldiers faced the elements with whatever clothing and shelter they could carry, often inadequate for the conditions they encountered. Summer campaigns brought their own miseries. Imagine marching 20 miles in the Virginia heat wearing a heavy wool uniform, carrying 40 pounds of equipment, with no effective way to cool down or find relief from the sun. The wool uniforms that provided some protection in winter became torture devices in summer heat. Soldiers marched with sweat pouring down their faces, their clothing soaked through, their leather equipment becoming slippery and uncomfortable. Dehydration was a constant threat during summer operations. Water sources were often contaminated, far apart, or simply unavailable during long marches. Men learned to ration their water carefully, but on the hottest days, this meant choosing between the immediate discomfort of thirst and the risk of running out of water entirely before reaching the next source. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke claimed soldiers regularly during summer campaigns. Men would simply collapse during marches, unable to continue in the oppressive heat. Those who fell behind often struggled to catch up with their units, and some were left behind entirely, hoping to recover enough strength to follow the army's trail. The dust during dry summer weather created its own problems. Marching columns kicked up clouds of dust that coated everything: clothing, equipment, food, and water. Soldiers marched with dust caking their faces, filling their nostrils, and irritating their eyes. The dust made breathing difficult and added to the general misery of summer campaigning. Winter brought different but equally challenging problems. The Civil War included some particularly harsh winters, and soldiers were often inadequately equipped to deal with severe cold. Many men had enlisted expecting a short war and hadn't anticipated spending multiple winters in the field. Their clothing was often insufficient for extended exposure to cold weather. Frostbite was common during winter campaigns. Soldiers' feet, inadequately protected by poor quality boots, suffered from prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. Fingers became numb and useless during cold weather, making it difficult to handle equipment or perform necessary tasks. In severe cases, frostbite led to amputation or death from secondary infections. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Without adequate shelter or heating, soldiers' body temperatures could drop to dangerous levels during cold nights. Men learned to share body heat, sleeping pressed together in whatever shelter they could construct or find. The lucky ones had blankets, but many soldiers spent winter nights with only their coats for warmth. The psychological effects of cold weather were as challenging as the physical effects. Cold made everything more difficult: loading a musket with numb fingers, writing letters when your hands shook uncontrollably, trying to eat food that had frozen solid. The constant discomfort of being cold affected morale and made every other aspect of military life more challenging. Rain created perhaps the most universally miserable conditions for Civil War soldiers. Unlike snow, which at least provided some insulation, rain soaked through everything and made it impossible to stay dry or warm. Wool uniforms, once wet, became heavy, uncomfortable, and slow to dry. Leather equipment swelled and became difficult to use. Marching in the rain turned roads into rivers of mud that could be knee-deep or deeper. Soldiers slipped and fell, equipment was lost in the mud, and the pace of movement slowed to a crawl. Wagon trains became hopelessly bogged down, creating supply problems that could last for days or weeks. Sleeping in the rain was nearly impossible. Tents, when available, often leaked, and many soldiers had no shelter at all. They learned to sleep sitting up against trees, to dig shallow trenches around their sleeping areas to divert water, and to accept that they would be wet and miserable until the weather changed. The combination of wet and cold created the most dangerous conditions. Wet clothing provided no insulation, and soldiers could become hypothermic even in relatively mild temperatures if they were soaked through. The risk of pneumonia and other respiratory diseases increased dramatically when men were forced to remain in wet clothing for extended periods. Equipment maintenance became critical during bad weather. Muskets had to be kept dry and functional despite constant exposure to moisture. Ammunition had to be protected from rain, and soldiers learned to wrap their cartridges in whatever waterproof material they could find. Wet gunpowder was useless, so keeping ammunition dry could be a matter of life and death. Some soldiers became remarkably resourceful at dealing with weather challenges. They learned to waterproof their equipment using animal fat or beeswax, to construct effective shelters from minimal materials, and to find ways to stay warm and dry in conditions that would challenge modern outdoor enthusiasts with sophisticated gear. A Civil War soldier's relationship with his equipment was intimate and complicated. These items, his musket, his clothing, his small collection of personal gear, were literally the tools that would determine whether he survived the war. Unlike modern soldiers with standardized, well-tested equipment, Civil War soldiers often made do with whatever was available regardless of quality or suitability. The musket was both lifeline and burden. Most soldiers carried either a Springfield rifle musket or an Enfield rifle, both single-shot weapons that required a complex loading procedure for each shot. The musket weighed about 9 pounds unloaded, and with bayonet attached, it became an unwieldy 40-inch-long tool that had to be carried everywhere. Loading the musket required a specific sequence of movements that soldiers drilled endlessly. Tear open a paper cartridge with your teeth, pour the gunpowder down the barrel, ram the bullet home with a ramrod, place a percussion cap on the nipple, cock the hammer, aim, and fire. An experienced soldier could complete this process in about 20 seconds under ideal conditions, but in the confusion and terror of battle, the process often took much longer. The musket had to be kept scrupulously clean to function properly. Black powder residue built up quickly, and a dirty musket was likely to misfire or fail to fire at all. Soldiers spent considerable time cleaning their muskets, using whatever cleaning materials they could find or improvise. Oil for lubricating the mechanisms was precious, and soldiers learned to make do with animal fat or other substitutes when proper gun oil wasn't available. Ammunition was carried in a cartridge box, a leather pouch that held 40 rounds when full. The cartridges were paper tubes containing a measured amount of gunpowder and a lead bullet. These cartridges were susceptible to moisture, and wet ammunition was useless. Soldiers learned to wrap their cartridge boxes in waterproof material when possible, and to check their ammunition regularly for signs of moisture damage. The bayonet, a 17-inch blade that attached to the end of the musket, transformed the weapon into a spear. While bayonet charges were rare in actual combat, the bayonet was useful as a general-purpose tool for digging, cutting, and various camp chores. The weight and length of the bayonet, however, made the already unwieldy musket even more difficult to handle. Clothing was a constant source of frustration. The standard uniform consisted of a wool coat, trousers, shirt, underwear, socks, and boots. In theory, this provided adequate protection from the elements. In practice, the quality of these items varied wildly depending on the manufacturer, and even good quality clothing deteriorated rapidly under the harsh conditions of military life. The wool coat was designed to provide warmth and durability, but it was hot and uncomfortable in summer weather and inadequate protection during harsh winter conditions. The wool retained odors, was difficult to clean, and became heavy and uncomfortable when wet. Soldiers often modified their coats, cutting off tails or sleeves to make them more practical for field conditions. Trousers took tremendous abuse during military service. Marching, crawling, climbing, and the general rough handling of field life wore through fabric quickly. Soldiers learned to patch their trousers with whatever material was available, creating garments that were functional but hardly military in appearance. Finding trousers that fit properly was often impossible, and soldiers made do with whatever size was available. Undergarments were crucial for comfort and health, but they were often the first items sacrificed when weight became critical during long marches. Those who kept their underwear faced the challenge of washing and drying it without adequate facilities or privacy. Many soldiers simply went without, adding to their discomfort but reducing the weight they had to carry. Socks were worth their weight in gold. A soldier's feet were his most important tools, and proper foot care was essential for survival. Good wool socks provided cushioning, absorbed moisture, and helped prevent blisters and frostbite. Soldiers hoarded socks, traded for them, and wrote home pleading for more. When socks wore out, soldiers learned to darn them, patch them, or wrap their feet in whatever cloth was available. Boots were perhaps the most critical piece of equipment a soldier owned. A good pair of boots could mean the difference between completing a march and being left behind. Unfortunately, military boots were often poorly made, ill-fitting, and inadequate for the demands placed on them. Soldiers marched hundreds of miles in boots that rubbed blisters, led in water, and fell apart at critical moments. The haversack, a canvas bag worn over the shoulder, carried the soldier's food, personal items, and any extra equipment he might need. The haversack had to be large enough to carry several days' worth of rations, but light enough to carry comfortably during long marches. Soldiers learned to pack their haversacks carefully, balancing necessity against weight. Personal items were limited to what could be carried comfortably. Most soldiers carried a Bible, some writing materials, perhaps a photograph of family members, and a few small personal mementos. Every ounce mattered during long marches, so soldiers continually evaluated their possessions, keeping only the most essential or emotionally important items. The canteen was a simple but essential piece of equipment. Made of tin or glass, it held about a quart of water when full. Soldiers learned to ration their water carefully and to refill their canteens whenever the opportunity arose. A broken or lost canteen could be a death sentence during summer campaigns or long marches between water sources. Rest now in the comfort of your modern conveniences, knowing that your ancestors endured these hardships so that future generations might live in greater comfort. If you're finding peace in this historical journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History for more restful trips through time. Despite all the hardships of daily military life, the moment of actual combat remained the ultimate test of a Civil War soldier's endurance, courage, and will to survive. Battle was the focal point around which all other military activities revolved, yet for most soldiers, actual combat represented only a small fraction of their total military experience. The approach to battle began long before the shooting started. Word would spread through the ranks that the enemy had been located, that orders were being prepared, that tomorrow or the next day would bring a fight. This knowledge created a peculiar atmosphere in camp, part anticipation, part dread, and part resignation to whatever fate might bring. Soldiers responded to the prospect of battle in different ways. Some became quiet and withdrawn, writing what might be their final letters home or spending time in solitary prayer or contemplation. Others became more animated, joking loudly, checking and rechecking their equipment, or engaging in the kind of nervous conversation that fills empty air without conveying much meaning. The night before a battle was rarely restful. Even exhausted soldiers found sleep elusive when they knew that dawn might bring their death. Men lay in their blankets staring at the stars, thinking about home, family, and all the things they might never see again. Some wrote in diaries or journals, trying to capture their thoughts and feelings for posterity. Others simply waited, listening to the sounds of thousands of other men doing the same thing. Morning brought the rituals of preparation. Equipment was checked one final time, musket clean and loaded, cartridge box full, bayonet sharp and secure. Personal items were often given to friends for safekeeping, with instructions about what to send home if the worst happened. Some men pinned pieces of paper with their names and addresses to their clothing, hoping that their bodies would be identified and their families notified if they were killed. The approach to the battlefield was often a confusion of movement and contradictory orders. Units marched toward the sound of gunfire, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, often moving laterally as commanders tried to position their forces effectively. The soldiers rarely had a clear picture of what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity, creating a sense of uncertainty and vulnerability. The sounds of battle were unlike anything these men had experienced in civilian life. The crack of musket fire, at first scattered and sporadic, building to sustained volleys that sounded like thunder. The boom of artillery pieces, felt as much as heard, creating concussions that could be felt in the chest and stomach. The screams of wounded men and horses, the shouted orders of officers, and the strange whistling sound of bullets passing overhead all combined to create an auditory landscape of chaos and terror. Smoke from black powder weapons quickly obscured the battlefield, creating a fog that made it difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction. Soldiers fired at muzzle flashes and shadows, often unable to tell if their shots were effective. The smoke burned eyes and throats, adding to the general discomfort and confusion of combat. The physical sensations of battle were overwhelming. The kick of the musket against the shoulder, repeated dozens of times during an engagement, left bruises that lasted for weeks. The taste of gunpowder from biting open cartridges coated the mouth and throat. Hands became black with powder residue, and faces were streaked with sweat and grime. The psychological impact of combat was perhaps even more challenging than the physical demands. Many soldiers experienced what we might now recognize as combat stress: shaking hands, difficulty concentrating, temporary deafness from the noise of gunfire, and a sense of unreality that made the entire experience seem like a nightmare from which they might wake up. Time behaved strangely during battle. Minutes could feel like hours during intense fighting, while entire engagements that lasted several hours might seem to pass in moments. Soldiers often had little sense of how long they had been fighting or how the larger battle was progressing beyond their immediate area. The randomness of death and injury in battle was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of combat. A man could fight bravely and skillfully all day and be killed by a stray bullet in the final moments of the engagement. Conversely, soldiers who seemed certain to be killed might emerge without a scratch while men around them fell. This randomness made it difficult to feel that courage, skill, or virtue had any bearing on survival. Watching friends and comrades fall was traumatic in ways that soldiers were unprepared for. The bonds formed during months of shared hardship made every casualty personal. Men watched their closest friends die in agony, often being unable to help due to the demands of continued fighting. The guilt of surviving when others didn't haunted many soldiers long after the war ended. The aftermath of battle brought its own horrors. The battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded of both sides, creating scenes of carnage that defied description. The sounds of wounded men calling for help, for water, or for their mothers continued long after the shooting stopped. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and death permeated everything. Caring for the wounded was a massive undertaking that often overwhelmed the available medical resources. Soldiers were detailed to carry wounded men to field hospitals, where overwhelmed surgeons performed amputations and other procedures with minimal anesthesia and primitive instruments. Many soldiers feared being wounded more than being killed, knowing that medical treatment might be worse than the original injury. Burying the dead was a grim but necessary task. After major battles, thousands of bodies had to be interred quickly to prevent disease. Soldiers dug mass graves and buried friend and foe alike, often with minimal ceremony or identification. Many families never learned the fate of their loved ones, who simply disappeared into unmarked graves on distant battlefields. In an age before telephones, radios, or any form of instant communication, letters were the only connection Civil War soldiers had to their families and their former lives. These fragile pieces of paper, carried in haversacks and coat pockets, became precious beyond measure, representing hope, love, and the promise of a world beyond war. Writing letters home was both a comfort and a torment for soldiers. The act of putting pen to paper allowed them to mentally escape, if only briefly, from their current circumstances and reconnect with the people and places they held most dear. Yet the very act of writing also emphasized the vast distance, both physical and experiential, that separated them from their loved ones. Soldiers faced the constant dilemma of what to tell and what to conceal in their letters. They wanted to maintain their family's morale and avoid causing unnecessary worry, but they also needed emotional support and understanding. Most letters struck a careful balance, emphasizing the writer's health and spirits while downplaying the true extent of hardship and danger. The practical challenges of letter writing in the field were considerable. Paper was often scarce and expensive. Ink was unreliable and sometimes had to be improvised from available materials. Finding adequate light to write by, a flat surface to write on, and enough privacy to concentrate were all ongoing challenges in camp life. Weather was a constant enemy of letter writing. Rain could destroy paper and make ink run. Wind scattered pages and made it impossible to control a pen. Cold made fingers too numb to hold writing implements properly. Many heartfelt letters were lost to the elements before they could be completed or sent. Mail delivery was irregular and unreliable. Letters might take weeks or months to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. Soldiers often wrote multiple letters on the same topic, hoping that at least one would get through. The postal system, overwhelmed by the volume of military mail and disrupted by military operations, functioned as well as could be expected under the circumstances. But soldiers never knew if their letters would reach home. Receiving letters from home was an event that could lift a soldier's spirits for days or plunge him into homesickness and despair. Good news from home, a successful harvest, a family celebration, word that everyone was healthy, provided motivation to continue enduring military hardships. Bad news, illness, death, financial problems, could devastate a soldier's morale and sometimes led to desertion attempts. The content of letters home reveals the universal human concerns that persisted despite the extraordinary circumstances of war. Soldiers wrote about their health, their daily activities, their hopes and fears. They asked about family members, neighbors, crops, and weather. They requested specific items, socks, food, medicine, or simply words of encouragement. Love letters between soldiers and their sweethearts or wives were particularly poignant. These intimate communications, often the only private moments couples could share for months or years, carried the weight of maintaining relationships across impossible distances. Many couples married by mail during the war, exchanging vows through letters when physical presence was impossible. Soldiers also corresponded with friends, former employers, and community members, maintaining connections to their civilian identities. These letters served as reminders that a world existed beyond the military, a world to which they hoped to return when the war ended. The process of writing letters became ritualized for many soldiers. They might set aside specific times for correspondence, create comfortable writing spaces in their tents or quarters, and develop personal traditions around the act of writing. Some soldiers kept copies of their letters, creating informal diaries of their military experiences. Reading and rereading letters from home was a common sight in military camps. Soldiers memorized their correspondence, shared news from home with friends, and treasured letters until they literally fell apart from handling. A letter from home could be read dozens of times, each reading providing comfort and connection to a soldier's former life. The loss of letters was a genuine tragedy for soldiers. Fire, water, theft, or simple carelessness could destroy these precious connections to home. Many soldiers carried their most important letters in waterproof containers or wrapped them in oiled cloth to protect them from the elements. As the war finally ground toward its conclusion, soldiers faced new challenges that were different from, but often as difficult as, the hardships they had endured during active campaigning. The process of transitioning from military to civilian life, of physically and emotionally returning home, proved to be more complex than many had anticipated during those long nights of dreaming about peace. The formal end of hostilities didn't immediately end the suffering for many soldiers. Demobilization was a slow, bureaucratic process that kept men in service for weeks or months after active fighting had ceased. Units were marched to designated locations where they waited for official discharge papers, final pay, and transportation home. These camps, filled with men eager to return to their families, were often as uncomfortable and poorly supplied as any they had experienced during the war. The journey home was itself an ordeal for many soldiers. Transportation systems, disrupted by years of war, were inadequate for moving hundreds of thousands of men back to their homes across the country. Soldiers crowded into railroad cars designed for freight, walked hundreds of miles when transportation wasn't available, or simply began making their way home by whatever means they could manage. Many soldiers discovered that home had changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. Families had adapted to their absence, taking on new roles and responsibilities. Communities had been transformed by the war's economic and social impacts. Young men who had left as teenagers returned as hardened adults, sometimes finding it difficult to relate to the people and places they had idealized during their service. The physical toll of military service continued long after discharge. Poor nutrition, exposure to disease, and the wear and tear of military life had left many men with health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Wounds that had seemed to heal properly often caused chronic pain or disability. The long-term effects of diseases contracted during service sometimes didn't manifest until years later. The psychological impact of military service was poorly understood at the time, but many veterans struggled with what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, sudden violent reactions to loud noises, difficulty sleeping, and problems with alcohol were common among veterans. Society had few resources for helping men cope with these invisible wounds of war. Economic readjustment was challenging for many veterans. Men who had spent years in military service found that their civilian skills had become rusty or obsolete. The economy had changed during the war, and opportunities that had existed before the conflict might no longer be available. Some veterans found themselves competing with others for limited jobs, while dealing with the physical and psychological limitations that military service had imposed. Many veterans found comfort in the company of other soldiers who had shared similar experiences. Veterans organizations formed in communities across the country, providing social support and advocacy for former soldiers. These groups became important sources of camaraderie and understanding for men who sometimes felt isolated in civilian society. The memory of the war became a defining feature of American culture for generations. Veterans told and retold their stories, often emphasizing the positive aspects of their service, while downplaying the hardships and trauma they had experienced. These narratives, shaped by time and the natural human tendency to find meaning in suffering, sometimes presented a more romantic view of military service than the reality had warranted. Families and communities created their own memories of the war period, often focusing on the sacrifices made on the home front and the joy of reunion when the soldiers returned. These memories, combined with the veterans' stories, created a complex cultural narrative about the war that emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph while sometimes glossing over the more difficult truths about the cost of the conflict. The physical reminders of the war, battlefields, monuments, cemeteries, became places of pilgrimage and remembrance. Veterans returned to visit the sites where they had fought, sometimes with former enemies, creating moments of reconciliation and shared memory that helped heal some of the psychological wounds of the conflict. For many veterans, the war remained the defining experience of their lives. They measured subsequent events against their military service, found civilian challenges less daunting after surviving combat, and carried with them a sense of having participated in something historically significant. This sense of having lived through momentous times provided some compensation for the hardships they had endured. The skills that soldiers had developed during their service, the ability to endure hardship, to work cooperatively under difficult conditions, to maintain hope in desperate situations, served many of them well in civilian life. Veterans often became community leaders, drawing on the leadership experience and maturity they had gained during military service. As we near the end of our journey through the daily struggles of Civil War soldiers, it's worth reflecting on what these experiences meant, both for the men who lived through them and for our understanding of human endurance and resilience. The soldiers whose stories we've explored tonight were, for the most part, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were farmers and clerks, immigrants and native-born Americans, educated and illiterate, young and middle-aged. What united them was not any special preparation for the hardships they would face, but rather their common humanity and their remarkable ability to adapt, endure, and find meaning in suffering. Their daily struggles with hunger, disease, discomfort, and fear were not the glamorous aspects of war that tend to be remembered in popular culture. There were no bands playing when they woke up sick in a muddy field, no cheering crowds when they ate moldy hardtack for the 100th time, no medals awarded for successfully treating dysentery or walking 20 miles in ill-fitting boots. Yet these mundane hardships, repeated day after day for months or years, required a kind of courage that was perhaps more demanding than the dramatic bravery displayed in battle. It took strength of character to maintain one's humanity while living in conditions that stripped away most of the comforts and dignities of civilized life. It required moral courage to care for sick comrades when you were exhausted and ill yourself, to share scarce food when you were hungry, to maintain hope when everything seemed hopeless. The soldiers developed coping mechanisms that reveal much about human adaptability. They found humor in the darkest situations, created communities of mutual support under the most challenging conditions, and maintained connections to their values and identities despite being surrounded by death and destruction. They learned to find comfort in small things: a letter from home, a successful foraging expedition, a night of sleep without rain. Their experiences also reveal the importance of meaning-making in human survival. Soldiers who maintained a sense of purpose, whether it was preserving the Union, ending slavery, defending their homeland, or simply surviving to return to their families, were often better able to endure hardships than those who lost sight of why they were suffering. The ability to place current pain in the context of larger goals or values seemed to provide psychological resources for endurance. The bonds formed between soldiers under these conditions were often extraordinarily strong. Men who shared these experiences developed relationships that lasted lifetimes, bound together by their common survival of circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. These relationships, forged in the crucible of shared hardship, often became more important than family ties or civilian friendships. The war also demonstrated the arbitrary nature of survival. Good men died while scoundrels lived. Brave soldiers were killed by random bullets while cowards survived unscathed. This randomness was difficult for many soldiers to accept and led to complex feelings about survival that persisted long after the war ended. Many veterans struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others had not. The long-term effects of these experiences extended far beyond the individual soldiers. The men who survived the war carried their experiences back to communities across America, influencing how subsequent generations thought about hardship, sacrifice, and national service. The stories they told, the values they emphasized, and the example they provided shaped American culture in ways that persisted well into the 20th century. Perhaps most importantly, their experiences remind us of the human capacity for endurance and adaptation. These men survived conditions that would challenge modern soldiers equipped with advanced technology, superior medical care, and better understanding of nutrition and psychology. They did so through resourcefulness, mutual support, and an often quiet determination to simply keep going. Let these stories of human endurance and resilience accompany you now as you drift towards sleep. If this journey through history has brought you peace, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History. Your support helps us continue sharing these restful explorations of our shared past. As our exploration of Civil War soldiers' daily struggles draws to a close, we find ourselves in the quiet hours of a camp somewhere in America, sometime between 1861 and 1865. The fighting has stopped for the day, the last watch has been set, and thousands of young men are settling down to whatever rest they can find on the hard ground, wrapped in threadbare blankets, listening to the sounds of an army trying to sleep. These men, whose stories we've followed through the mud and hunger and disease and fear, were heroes of a different sort than those celebrated in monuments and history books. They were heroes of endurance rather than action, of quiet persistence rather than dramatic gesture. Their heroism was measured not in moments of glory, but in the accumulation of countless small acts of survival, cooperation, and simple human decency under conditions that tested every aspect of their character. Consider the unnamed soldier who shared his last piece of hardtack with a sick comrade, knowing that he would go hungry as a result. Think about the young man who spent his precious free time writing letters for illiterate fellow soldiers, connecting them to families they might never see again. Remember the veteran who took a frightened new recruit under his wing, teaching him the small skills and knowledge that might keep him alive. These were not the actions that won battles or decided the fate of nations, but they were the actions that preserved humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. They represent a kind of moral courage that is perhaps more admirable than physical bravery because it was sustained day after day, week after week, without recognition or reward. The soldiers learned to find meaning and even joy in the smallest things. A successful foraging expedition that provided fresh vegetables for dinner became a celebration. A letter from home was a treasure to be shared and savored. A night of sleep without rain was a gift to be appreciated. They developed an ability to extract maximum satisfaction from minimal comfort that served them well during their service and often throughout their lives. Their relationships with each other evolved into something deeper than ordinary friendship. Men who had shared the experience of nearly dying from disease, of carrying wounded comrades from battlefields, of dividing their last rations when everyone was hungry, developed bonds that transcended normal social connections. They became brothers in a way that civilian relationships rarely match, united by their common survival of experiences that pushed them to their limits. The war taught them lessons about life that they carried forward into peacetime. They learned that humans can endure far more than they imagined possible, that cooperation and mutual support are essential for survival, that hope can persist in even the darkest circumstances, and that the small kindnesses between people are often more important than grand gestures or dramatic events. Many of these men returned home with a different perspective on what constituted genuine hardship. Having survived on hardtack and muddy water, having slept in the rain for weeks at a time, having marched until their feet bled, they found civilian complaints about minor discomforts somewhat amusing. This perspective sometimes created distance between them and those who hadn't shared similar experiences, but it also provided them with a resilience that served them well in facing life's inevitable challenges. Their experiences also gave them a deep appreciation for the ordinary comforts of civilian life that others took for granted. A hot meal, a dry bed, clean clothes, a warm house. These became sources of profound gratitude rather than simple expectations. Many veterans maintained this appreciation throughout their lives, never quite losing their amazement at the abundance and comfort of peacetime America. The stories of these soldiers remind us that history is made not just by presidents and generals and the dramatic events that capture headlines, but by countless individuals who simply do their duty under difficult circumstances. The preservation of the Union, the end of slavery, the transformation of American society. These grand historical outcomes were achieved through the accumulated actions of hundreds of thousands of ordinary men, who got up each morning and faced another day of hardship with whatever courage and determination they could muster. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, surrounded by the safety and security that these men helped preserve, take a moment to appreciate the contrast between your circumstances and theirs. The clean sheets, the warm blankets, the knowledge that you'll wake up in the same place you went to sleep, the certainty that food and clean water will be available when you need them. These are luxuries that Civil War soldiers could only dream about during their long years of service. Their legacy is not just in the political and social changes that resulted from their war, but in their demonstration of human capacity for endurance, adaptation, and mutual support under the most challenging conditions. They showed that ordinary people, when circumstances demand it, can achieve extraordinary things through simple persistence and basic decency. Let their example of quiet heroism accompany you into sleep, a reminder that courage often manifests not in dramatic moments, but in the daily choice to continue, to care for others, and to maintain hope when hope seems unreasonable. Their struggles are over now, their hardships ended, their long march finally completed. They have found the rest that eluded them for so many cold, uncomfortable nights during their years of service. And now, as you drift off to the comfortable sleep that they earned for future generations, remember to like this video if it brought you peace, and subscribe to Doze Through History for more restful journeys through our shared past. Until next time, sleep well, and dream of the quiet heroes who came before us. The camp is quiet now. The last embers of the fires have died down to glowing ash. The sentries pace their posts under a canopy of stars that looks the same as it did over your childhood home, though everything else has changed so completely. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls, and for just a moment, it could be any peaceful evening in any safe place. The soldiers sleep as best they can, some snoring softly, others shifting restlessly as dreams carry them back to farmyards and family kitchens, and all the places they hope to see again. Their weapons rest beside them, their muddy boots serve as pillows, and their threadbare blankets provide what comfort they can manage. Tomorrow will bring another day of the same struggles we've explored together. The search for decent food, the march with heavy packs over rough roads, the constant battle against disease and discomfort, and the gradual wearing away of everything that once seemed solid and permanent. But tonight, for these few hours, there is rest. These men, whose daily struggles we've shared, earned something more valuable than the medals and monuments that would later commemorate their service. They earned the knowledge that they had endured, that they had maintained their humanity under conditions designed to strip it away, and that they had contributed to something larger than themselves through their simple persistence in the face of overwhelming difficulty. Their story is not just history. It's a testament to what humans can survive when they must, what they can achieve when they work together, and what they can preserve when they refuse to give up hope. As you drift off to sleep in comfort and safety, carry with you their example of quiet courage and their demonstration that even in the darkest times, dawn eventually comes. The long march is over. The struggle is finished. The watch is ended. Sleep now and dream of home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If this tale helped you find peace, please like, subscribe, and share Doze Through History with others who might find comfort in these restful explorations of our past. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you on our next historical adventure into peaceful slumber.